A lot of the work that you do today relates to how we are shaped by the kind of information and environment that we're in. So I wonder about the environment that you grew up in and how that shaped you and steered you to your current path.
Surely. And thank you for inviting me to be on this podcast. My youth really started off quite internationally, which is also one of the reasons why I sort of don't really identify much with one particular country. When I was half a year old, my parents moved from the Netherlands to the US, and I was there at a research laboratory. My dad was working in high energy physics. That came a little bit later. This was Brookhaven National Laboratory in the US. But we were actually living on campus there, so with the international community. And I'm told, I don't remember, I was half a year old. My first friend as a baby was a Japanese girl, and so we were just communicating like babies do. But that may have had an influence on me, considering that my wife is also Japanese. So my dad was sort of early in his career as a researcher, academic. You go through a period of being a postdoc researcher, which tends to be more shorter term kinds of projects that you're going to a couple of different labs. So it was at Brookhaven for a bit, then to Canada, to Winnipeg, one of the coldest spots in Canada in the winter. And then back to the Netherlands. I actually went to a European school, which is a school system set up by the European Union as part of their system of entries, more getting people more to think across borders. While we were living in the Netherlands, I was in the German section. Usually it's like 7 to 9 kids in a class. I was fairly good at math and science kind of things. It was great supportive kind of environment, but because it was an international school, not a national one, a bit separated from the rest of what's going on in the country, and also a bit of a travel every day going by train, 45 minutes. So some time to read also. And we were reading a lot of science fiction, including my parents, plus my dad's work in science. At that time, he'd already joined the Dutch branch of CERN, so NICEF, the Dutch High Energy Physics Laboratory that contributes to the work in CERN. And we also spent 1 year in Geneva because he was placed there then. When I was looking to graduate in high school, my thinking was completely, yeah, obviously I'm going to do something physics or engineering. And so I guess I moved into doing electrical engineering as a degree, not so much from having thought deeply about what are all the actual opportunities that exist, but more from, well, I'm fairly good in this kind of direction and it's cool doing engineering things. I was sort of thinking a bit more in the area of robotics at that time, not so much of applied robotics, but more of developmental robotics. So robots that learn from engaging with the environment and in a way can help us be a tool for us to study actually how people and animals are shaped by their environment in the way that they then also understand their environment. I did my master's project was on fuzzy neural networks. It combines fuzzy logic and artificial neural networks. At that time, artificial neural networks were much smaller than the deep learning systems that we currently have. Basically, the compute facility wasn't there yet. We weren't really using GPUs yet. We weren't using the massively parallel processing kind of systems in this kind of space. So it was a very small kind of neural network, but the challenges were actually quite similar to what we're having now, which is how do we understand what the system has actually learned, especially if you're looking at it like I was from a point of view of how can we use these types of things to learn how humans also learn and engage, and basically how the whole interaction between stimuli, external stimuli and internal model generation, how that works. So that's why the fuzzy logic part came in, which is a way of trying to create rules in the machines that are easier to read. So instead of having a rule that says, if this parameter reaches 7.6, then you go to that kind of thing and you don't know how to interpret 7.6. It would be if this parameter goes high, or if it's in the medium range or something like that, which is more the way in which humans look at kind of things. It provides distributions that sort of cover any area. And the idea was to have the neural network actually parameters learn fuzzy rules, and that you would then be able to learn to read the rules. Theory is great. It worked reasonably, but the problem is you would present it with a test set where as a human you can describe it with 5 rules relative. It's an experiment we're doing to try and make things transparent. The system learns to reproduce the behavior fairly well, but it learns like 50 rules. Can I interpret these 50 different rules for something that I know should be grabbed by just 5? How can I reduce the complexity of the system? So that was actually what a lot of the work was on. And that's very similar to the types of challenges that we see as well now with big deep learning systems. It's less the problem that you wouldn't be able to trace a particular kind of relationship from an input to an output. How did it get from this to that? But rather, you have so many parameters in there. How can you reduce it down to these are actually the relevant ones? This is the thing that really drove that particular decision. The kind of big challenge behind explainability, which still goes back to my initial question of how did we learn? How did we come to interpret the world in this particular way based on what we experienced before? It depends a bit what it is that you're trying to achieve with a particular thing, of course. You can say the only thing that matters for me is to get a good, reliable kinds of outcome, in which case maybe a high level of complexity isn't that problematic as long as you can actually prove that it's going to be reliable, and that's difficult. But if you're saying, I actually want to understand what's going on, and often the reason why you want to understand is because that is the way in which to get the proof of how it's going to behave when it comes to a new stimulus. But then you're always in the, but if I reduce the complexity, I'm simplifying something and it won't be as perfect. There's this saying, every model is wrong, but some models are useful. If you say we want to understand the human brain by simulating it down to the absolute details, so you're just going to recreate a complete human brain, then you're back where you started because it's got the same level of complexity. But actually, that is sort of the direction that I went in. After finishing my master's, my PhD was in computational neuroscience, because on the one hand, the state of the technology at that time and also the AI was going into a mini winter again. So funding was being reduced. There basically wasn't that much pure science space for AI at that particular point. I actually went to Utrecht University in the physics department, but doing computational neuroscience. It was a slightly odd group in the physics department called Physics of Man, Physics of Humans, looking at how human perception and behavior relates to the physical stimuli in the world. So I was particularly looking at eye movement control, and basically sort of the question of, you have 6 muscles on the eye, but as the eye rotates, the exact way in which the force that a muscle exerts on the eye and what kind of an impact that would have on the movement of the eye changes a bit. So you look at how that physics of the rotation relates to the control signals that you need to have, and then looking at how the brainstem circuit in the human brain actually generates those. So looking at the sensory motor loop. And one of the reasons why an area where sensory motor and central perception, those kinds of things, are an area where there's a lot of work in neuroscience, because it's easier to know if you're doing something completely cognitive, you don't have an objective way of measuring did it happen or not. You can only rely on what the subject tells you, and the subject is making inferences and you have no idea how those are working. But if you're looking at something like sensory motor control, well, you can measure how the eye moved and you know where the visual stimulus was and those kinds of things. So you have at least the ultimate input and the ultimate output objectively, and then you can start working from there.
To do the work that you were doing, wouldn't that mean that you needed access to data that, say, a psychologist would have, which you wouldn't necessarily have?
Even though we were in the physics department, it was part of an interdisciplinary group. So together with people in the psychology department, in the biology department, in the School of Medicine, I guess my work was actually more with the School of Medicine. And we were running experiments ourselves as well with human subjects. So I was a human subject for tons of experiments, which basically consists mostly of sitting in a dark room and looking at a single dot of light and trying not to fall asleep while you're doing the task. But there was a lot of interdisciplinary work involved. And actually that is one of the things that I enjoyed very much, is interdisciplinarity and communicating between disciplines, bridging. How do people with a different perspective look at understanding, sort of communicating about the same thing, making sure that when we say a word, we mean the same thing, but just also the underlying concepts that people bring to it in a way that probably also connects to my upbringing in an international school. Everybody's coming in there with a different language background, etc., and you're communicating interculturally. And in a way, this is the culture of scientific disciplines and bridging between those. And that's really where I continued to work, was always sort of on the intersection between disciplines, be it in doing computational neuroscience, psychophysics, so that's the psychology from physics, or doing biologically inspired robotics, or using robotics to test models of how the human brain works and those kinds of things. It was always on the intersection between things. And also gradually starting to look at the intersection between science and things outside of the academic realm. After I finished my PhD, I went to France and I was working in a medical research lab there. And that's actually also where I met my wife, in the research lab. And then from there came to the UK for the first time. I've been in and out to the UK a couple of times now, working in London at UCL. That was a psychology research. And then from there to Kyoto to a robotics lab, supporting the work on a humanoid robot. A bit similar, obviously more primitive than the current version, but sort of similar to the types of robots that Boston Dynamics is doing now, which are very much about being able to dynamically respond to how the stimuli change in the world in a quick way so that the system doesn't fall over, stuff like that. And then from there, back to the UK to University of Sheffield, where I was working in a psychology department, but the head of particular research lab actually is the head of the Sheffield robotics unit as well. So continuing that intersection kind of thing. Then from there to Tokyo, to the Riken Institute, which was actually motivated because my wife got involved in Japanese politics. But this was 2010 that we came in. And you might remember what happened in 2011 with a big earthquake and the Fukushima nuclear disaster that motivated us to leave in 2012. Just wasn't that fun going to the supermarket and checking, where is this grown? Is this grown somewhere closer to where there's radiation? Where was this fish caught? And those kinds of questions. While we were in Tokyo, I started thinking a bit outside of the computational neuroscience kind of space, more around also how internet data or the wide level of data of human interactions on the internet, how that can be used through something called computational social science. So studying human interaction or human use of language through people's Twitter feeds. So I started playing around with that idea and I sort of created a project proposal in that space. At the same time, also looking at data sharing between scientific disciplines, because there was a growing institute around sharing of MRI data and electrophysiological data, so the direct measurement data, but less around sharing of the behavioral data. But actually, I know behavioral roboticists who are trying to learn from how to make a robot learn how to move its own limbs are quite interested in the kind of data that psychologists collect about babies, how they learn to control their body. But they publish in different journals. Their data is held in different formats and those kinds of things. And so I was actually looking to start up data sharing thing between those. So when we moved back to the UK again, we went to Birmingham into a lab which was doing work on human-robot interaction, handing over objects between a human and a robot. And frankly, the way in which most robots will hand over an object to a human is really annoying because they take a lot of time to make sure that they're very precise in how they hand it over. But if you look at how humans interact, they're much less focusing on the precision, because as I move to you, you will adjust to how I do and we will get there together. Sort of what's more important is that we do it smoothly, that I don't end up waiting a couple of seconds before you react. But at the same time, I was looking at that data sharing, started sort of a wiki kind of thing for that. But that ran into a spam problem. I didn't have a lot of resources to maintain the kind of thing, and people started spamming it with advertising and things that wasn't supposed to be on there. So in the end, I had to close it down. But it did help me to bring me to the next step, which was moving more into that computational social science. I started running some workshops at the University of Birmingham around that and actually invited academics from various parts of the UK. But then sort of through that, made a connection with the University of Nottingham with the Horizon Digital Economy Research Institute, which is looking at really the impact of digital on society. They were starting up a new project called CASMA, citizen-centric analysis of social media. And that's sort of where I moved to next and was able to focus much more that, and where the focus also shifted more into sort of the ethics questions. Like, okay, it's great to be able to use somebody's conversation on Twitter at that time, the API was still more open to that for linguistic research. But if you were the person who had actually posted those things on Twitter and you found out that somebody was doing some kind of an analysis of you, and maybe they're not doing an analysis of how language is used, but they're doing a psychological analysis of how human behavior is shaped. And then you think, somebody's building a personal profile of me from things that I posted on Twitter. Do I really feel comfortable about that? Even though I know I'm communicating in a public space, I know that Twitter is visible from all kinds of sides. But it's sort of the analogy that I've taken is it's like you're talking to somebody in a pub or in a cafe or something like that. You know that people around you can hear it, but that's different than having somebody who's sitting next to you recording what you're saying. You wouldn't be comfortable with that, even though you know you're in a public space speaking. So question about what is our way in which we actually communicate with the people who had generated that data, and the ethics of using data for a purpose that is different from what the initial person thought that the data was going to.
It sounds like the root of that concern is really in the lack of consent that was obtained, which is one of those three main ethical concerns that you had highlighted in this 2015 paper that I read, the ethics of personalized information filtering, which I thought was really interesting.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it started from that, from the consent kind of question and sort of the privacy question. And if we put it also in the historical stage, this is 2014-15, which is also where GDPR was still being worked on. And a lot of the question was around big data and data collection. AI hadn't really become the theme of discussion so much yet. It was sort of still the data collection phase of it. And so, yes, the initial thing was more around that consent methods. And we all know that the consent box, tick box for I give consent is meaningless, because even if you were to read the text, you're not actually thinking about it in the same way, because you are thinking about this piece of data that I'm making available right now. You're not thinking about this piece plus the piece that I'm going to make available tomorrow, etc., and how those all add up into a bigger set of knowledge about you than that single item that you're engaging with. And it's not reasonable to expect a person to think of that when they're just confronted with a tick box and actually, I really wanted to do this thing now and I have other things I want to be doing, so I'll just tick yes. So that's why we need a different process. In the academic space, it needs to be the ethics review committee before the research project even starts. They need to be thinking about what is the right way of doing it. Is consent the only way? Even if you were to get consent, do we consider this to be an ethical research project? And one of the big issues in the academic space is being consistent as to how we actually do the ethics review across disciplines, because the same research project could be run out of the computer science department, out of the psychology department, out of the economics department. They all think about human interaction and electronic data differently. The psychology department may say this is a human interaction, that what we're having right now, and so therefore we need to be treating this the same way as if a human was in the lab. The economics department might think of this more, the recording of this, as this is archive data. There's no human involved in this interaction directly, so it's just about intellectual property rights. So different ways of thinking about the ethics. So it started with the thinking about the privacy, the consent kinds of questions, but then through working on that, and actually it was at a conference I went to in France where there was a lot of presentations about recommender systems, that I started thinking about closing the loop, that it's not just about the collection of the data, but also how that data then is used to shape the kind of information that we receive back, and that your experience of the internet is going to be different from my experience of the internet as recommender systems keep shaping, so-called personalizing. But is it personalizing, or is it serving the company that's delivering you the product?
There are essentially three types of recommender systems, right? And the majority is a hybrid. Could you elaborate a bit for those who don't actually know what recommender systems are, how they work?
So recommender systems is basically any of these systems that are, and they're actually necessary, that are reducing down the huge amount of data that exists to those things that are most likely to be of relevance to you. Now, whether it is of relevance to you because of things that are of interest to you, or it's relevance to you because the person who's trying to sell something to you is trying to find the best way of targeting people to sell to, is a business model kind of question. But recommender systems are basically, they help you find the potential needles in the haystack by reducing down to what are the most likely relevant things. And there's different ways of approaching that. One is to track what you are doing. So it's collecting data from you directly, your previous interactions with the system, or it could be giving a couple of keywords, for instance, in it. And so a search engine is, in a sense, it's also a recommender system. The other way is to look at other people who are similar to you. What have they shown interest in? So that's likely is something that you're going to be interested in. So that's something that social media does a lot. That's where something like Facebook's, their social graph comes in. It's identifying, well, you've been interacting with these things, that other person's been interacting with that. Well, that means you're probably similar in your interests. So if that other person just now showed an interest in that thing, then you're likely to be interested in that thing. So we will give that to you. So that's sort of more a social way of connecting and identifying what is the right kind of recommendation to give to people. Often it is a mix of these. It uses your history of your own interactions and similarity to others of your type. They both have their challenges. Like if you're looking at the history of you, if you're just joining the system, you don't have a history. So how are we going to start off this process of doing it? Whereas if you're doing the social graph thing, we can ask you at the beginning, import your friends circle from your phone, as we are familiar with Instagram and stuff like that. We'll be able to start from that kind of thing. But of course, it has the other challenge that if you don't have a network, if there aren't many people on the place, then it won't be able to give you any good recommendations, which is where the network effects come into play, where, you know, if you have a big social media platform, it will be the attractive place to be because it will naturally be able to produce the better recommendations, and obviously also your friends are more likely to be there. Whereas you may be creating a new social media platform which has much better functionality in theory, but because there's nobody there, nobody wants to go there. So how are you going to get that process going to get people there? That's difficulty. And that's one of the reasons why relying on just free market competition as a way of making sure that social media platforms operate in the best interest of users doesn't really work. So the self-regulation, if the platform is doing things that users don't really like, users will leave, doesn't really work that well because there's so many other factors that are making you stick on that platform. The fact that your other friends are already there, those kinds of things. That's why there's the growing recognition that this space needs external regulation from government. And that is sort of also where my work tended towards after starting to look into the ethics kind of side and then starting to look at the recommender systems and the feedback loop and the bias that can arise within that kind of feedback loop, which is the Unbias Project that we started. We started also increasingly looking at engaging with policymaking and with industry, how they're, so when we actually proposed the Unbiased Project, we consciously made one part of the project, which was the part that I was leading, was stakeholder engagement, including engaging with policymakers. So responding to parliamentary inquiries, writing opinion pieces, publishing things in the conversation on editorial responsibility of social media platforms, as well as working with civil society. So we started working closely with the Five Rights Foundation. Actually, they weren't called that yet, but Biban Kidron, who's leading that, she created Five Rights Foundation like a year or so after we started collaborating. But she was already working on the question about how do young people understand the internet and understanding the concerns about privacy, about personal agency on the internet from the point of view of young people, not having adults tell them, don't do this on the internet, don't do that because safety or evil people on the internet. But actually, what is it that young people think? And what do young people already know about the space? How much do they know? And sometimes they know more than the teachers do. And we had great conversations with groups of teenagers, sort of 13 to 17-year-olds was our focus group. They'd been doing some research on how long does Snapchat retain the data if you send a message that was supposed to disappear after 24 hours? Does it really completely disappear from Snapchat, or do they keep it for a longer period and those kinds of things? One person had done research by checking Wikipedia and other things. The other person had been reading through the terms and conditions deeply. They came to different conclusions. It's difficult to know who was right.
So in the Unbiased Project, you actually used youth juries. What were the findings that you had from these youth juries?
So youth juries was basically this, really about hearing from the young people. The idea is we go to them, we have a group of something like 12, could be plus minus 4 people in that group, present them with a couple of scenarios, just tell them about which kind of social media are you using? Have you ever noticed how when you looked at one thing on the internet and then afterwards you go into the social media, you start to seeing more ads that are related to that and those kinds of questions. But then from there, really let the young people start to take the conversation forward. And then what is it that they are concerned about? A lot of their concern was around questions of being able to be in control, being annoyed that they're using this thing and they keep getting recommendations that aren't right, or that the thing keeps popping up when they're trying to go to sleep. They know that they're supposed to go to sleep now, but it keeps getting notifications and they're having difficulty putting the thing aside. So actually they were raising a lot of the kinds of issues around dark patterns that we're seeing now as well, the kind of how the interface is crafted in a way to make you stay on the platform even when you know that that isn't good for you.
That's actually the third ethical concern that was in your paper, right? The fact that it's actually, there are a series of nudges, and it's not as though the action comes out of the blue. It happens over a long period of time.
Yes. Yes. And that's a huge challenge from a regulatory perspective. How can you identify whether this is a problematic thing? Because it's easier to regulate if you say, look for where this particular recommendation or this particular mode of action of the platform has directly caused a problem. But if it is not like that, if it's just a case of, yeah, it gave you a bit of a suggestion towards this, and then you did, and then it gave you a bit more of a suggestion towards that, and you gradually end up spending more and more time thinking about particular issues that you can't pinpoint that this particular action was the thing that was the problem. Or at the bigger scale, in sort of the impact that social media is having on democracy, how it is just gradually pushing groups away from each other to make it more difficult to communicate to people who don't have the same mindset as you do, and those kinds of things. But there isn't really a single cutoff where you can say, this is where they did something bad. So how do you measure that in order to be able to say this is a problematic usage of the technology?
You say that the movement of anti-vaxxers, I mean, like this manipulation, that's what led to the fact that this was such a huge movement around. Even if you were aware that this was happening, how do you know when to step in?
I think what we're seeing now with the kind of data that is being presented before the various parliaments in the Facebook leaks is clearly the kind of thing where we have a problem. I mean, we've known from the beginning that if you are in charge of doing the recommendations, you are shaping the kind of information that our people are seeing. And so you should be taking a responsibility over it. You can't just say, well, we didn't create the content, so therefore we don't have responsibility for it. We choose whether it goes on the front or on the back of the content list. We choose whether it's in that space that we, through meticulous psychological research, identified as the spot on the screen that you're most likely to be paying attention to. And then to see in these data that they've actually researched this and they've come to the conclusion that they are definitely driving people into a problematic space, but they're not going to change it because it would impact their bottom line economically. We clearly have a problem, and we need an external party to be making those kinds of decisions, a party that isn't linked to that question of does it give in money or not, the impact that it has on the funding stream.
A bit like the oversight committee that Facebook has established then.
Yes, but with more power, because the oversight committee at Facebook, they can only, regarding individual posts or individual kinds of actions, they can make a ruling, and they can strongly suggest that Facebook should change their perspective, but they still can't actually force Facebook to change anything. It needs to be more like what we had in radio and TV and other broadcast media, where you have an external regulator that looks at it and says, if you're actually not following these rules, we can take away your license and you won't be allowed to continue broadcasting. There needs to be something of that nature that can actually say, if the social media platform is knowingly not stopping the spread of fake news, is knowingly pushing people into more extremes, even though they are aware that that can help lead to harm to the people. I mean, Facebook this was now a couple of years ago, was also talking to advertisers, telling them, based on the data that we collect about people, we can identify that this young person is currently in a more depressed mode and therefore more likely to be, if you give them that certain ad at this moment, they're likely to buy it. How can that be considered ethically responsible behavior as a society? It doesn't fit with our societal moral values. And so there needs to be an actual capacity to trace these kinds of behaviors. Them being able to do it is, of course, not the same thing as them actually doing it. Of course, them talking to advertisers about this suggests that they do intend to do it. So there needs to be an oversight capacity that can actually track how these things are being used and monitoring this and being able to directly interfere with or
You've been writing about this editorial responsibility beyond this part of social media since 2016. I can imagine a lot of people were on your side. Do you feel like the climate has changed, especially in recent times, and people are more open to the fact that, yes, they play a greater role than we would like to think and acknowledge?
certainly the recognition that this is a serious problem has grown a lot. I think even in 2016, there were a lot of people that would agree with the core issue that this is something that should be happening, but it wasn't recognized as how much of an impact it really has. And therefore that this needs to be acted on more strongly. And of course, there is a kind of tension between different fundamental rights. There's the tension between freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and the rights of being an entrepreneur and creating your own platform and actually being able to experiment with what is the best tool. So tension still exists, but it is now more clear how significant the impact is on the rights to safety and security and basic freedom of thought, that you're actually, in a sense, somewhat restricting a certain level of freedom of speech opens up more freedom of thought, because people are being less manipulated into how they are shaping their concepts. So I think it has moved up more on the agenda as how important it is. And we're seeing, especially in the US, where freedom of speech is a core fundamental principle, more so, or in a slightly different way than in Europe, that the perspectives are a bit changing on that as well. I do expect that there will be some kind of a response in the US at this time. I don't know how many times that Facebook has been before Congress for issues. They accumulate. And I think this time a tipping point has been reached that something will happen, but how much will happen and how exactly, that isn't clear yet. It's an interesting thing to be observing. My own focus has shifted a little bit away from that social media platforms and the communication side to the way in which the underlying technology, the AI, is impacting on the broader way in which businesses use these tools for lots of things, not just communication side, but also like the logistics or financial services or those kinds of things. My work in standards development, which came out of the Unbias Project as well, was the route towards how do we bring the findings of that research project into the industry space. Standards is an interesting space because it often gets criticized as very dominated by industry. Regulators or legislators or parliaments, they set rules. Regulators are supposed to implement them. And to do that, they point to standards. They say, well, if you are compliant with ISO 27001, then you are probably good as far as cybersecurity is concerned. So then it's actually the standard that defines how they are implementing things. But the standard is written to a large part by industry players. And so there's the problem of, does it undermine the democratic process? Because we've actually got pictures like the backroom dealings, the smoky room, where the industry guys get together and say, well, they tell us we're supposed to do this, but we'll implement it in that way so that we can get away with this. It's definitely true that standards development is dominated by industry participants, but it's not because it is not open to other participants. Actually, anybody can join the British Standards Institute. You can say, I have been working in the space. I'm an academic or civil society person who's been looking AI. I have understanding in the space and I have an interest in this new standard on algorithmic bias. You can join the working group and you can participate in developing it. The challenge is finding the time to do it because it's all voluntary. And that's sort of where the industry has the advantage, that it's from the standards development group, it's voluntary, but the industry can just appoint a person and say, well, your job is going to be working at the standards development and we're going to pay you for it. Yeah. But it is in principle open for participants. And in the IEEE standard, we did make an effort to get an equal spread of industry, academic, and civil society people contributing, especially because it's an ethics related standard. We need not just technical, we need people with the legal, people with psychological, people with culture, social science background. We need all of those perspectives in there to build an appropriate standard. And it's been an interesting journey